Dear colleagues and guests, I would like to welcome you to the third lecture in this series that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences has organized to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Robert College and Boğaziçi University. I will give you now a small sort of history of Robert College and Boğaziçi University, which is of course prepared by our Dean, Gülen Aktaş, who unfortunately could not make it today. So this is her work, no plagiarism. The idea of Robert College began on the suggestion of two brothers, James and William Dwight, sons of Dr. Otis Dwight, a pioneer researcher of the Near East for the American missionary effort. Their intention was to establish a secular institution of higher learning in Istanbul, entirely separate from the American missionary colony in the Ottoman Empire. A noted New York merchant and philanthropist of Christian causes, Christopher Rhinelander Robert, agreed to supply the funds, and the mission of establishing the institution was given to Cyrus Hamlin, the director of the Bebek Seminary, a man with a long experience in the missionary education in the Ottoman Empire, but with his own practical and pragmatic approach to education. The idea came from the Dwight brothers, the money from Robert, and the energy, the oversight, and the actual implementation from Hamlin. And what emerged was definitely not a missionary school, and not a secular school, but a school with liberal New England educational lines led by individuals with strong Christian values, and the college opened its doors in 1863 to Bulgarian, Armenian, Greek, and other minorities living in the Ottoman Empire. The integration of the college into the Turkish educational scene possibly begins with the graduation of the first Turkish student, Hüseyin Pektaş, in 1903. That year, there were 320 students from 14 different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and of this number, only 6 were Turks. During the next 30 years, the enrollment went up to 750, and the proportion of Turks rose to more than 50%. A major contribution to the integration came from the establishment of the engineering school in 1912. By the early 1950s, the college had established its prestige in Turkey, and with the increasing demand, 2 new faculties, the School of Sciences and Languages and the School of Business Administration and Economics, were added in 1959. Established in a tumultuous time and at the center of the world, as the college song begins, the college survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the fall of an empire, and the foundation of a new republic, throughout which it never closed its doors for a single day. When it celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1963, the college had reached its widest state of extension, with a women's college on the Arnavutköy campus, and a men's high school and a university on the Bebek campus. However, for all its continued growth and success, the history of Robert College had been haunted with one major recurring theme: the shortage of funds. And in 1970, when it was financially impossible to keep the present structure, the Board of Trustees decided to keep a co-ed high school on the Arnavutköy campus and to hand this campus and the mission of a university education to the Turkish state. So was born Boğaziçi University in 1971. Since then, Boğaziçi University has grown to be a much larger institution with more than 13,000 students, about 500 faculty members, and a large graduate school, and in its 42 years established a reputation of its own as the leading university in Turkey. But it has never broken its ties with its past, the heritage of Robert College, and the fact that it grew out of Robert College continues to leave its mark, to inspire its direction, and to guide its development into the future. We hope that this lecture series, in the variety of its offerings and the excellence of its content, will be seen as a fitting contribution to the continuation of this tradition. And I now invite Eva-Marie Dubuisson from the Department of Sociology to introduce our speaker of today.
I will try to keep this brief. I've timed it. We are very, very fortunate to be able to welcome Anne-Laura Stoller in our campus and community today, as she is a scholar who's had such a profound impact on so many different fields of inquiry. Anne Stoller is currently the Willy Brandt Distinguished University Professor of Anthropology and Historical Studies at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and she taught previously for a number of years at the University of Michigan, where I had the privilege to meet her. Anne has, of course, published extensively in her career. The most recent volume we're most familiar with is Along the Archival Grain, and as it turns out, as she announced when she arrived yesterday, that the newest project, Imperial Debris on Ruins and Ruination, has just come out. And she is in the process, as ever, in her active and energetic engagement with new projects, 2 more of which are forthcoming. The next will be Durabilities in Duress, correct? I get it wrong. Durabilities of Duress. She's here to talk to us about some of the new directions in her thinking and research today, and as a way to anticipate that, I would suggest that we can consider looking at her body of work as a sort of nascent totalness over time, and at the themes which emerge therein, the most clear of which is a great challenge, actually, to all of us reading and thinking in these fields. The challenge is to break apart the categories in which we work, think, live, and presume to know about each other in the world. From early on, Anne has written with a sort of fierce epistemological desire to undo, to unravel the taken for granted and the mirage of essentialist ontologies, particularly in the context of the study of power and history. We could look at many examples from her work, fundamental themes like colonize colonize ed, colonial, post-colonial. She also demands that we call into question the categorical imperatives that various theoretical approaches and disciplines seem to demand, and to step outside of those frameworks as well. Anne has stepped outside. She works in an inherently interdisciplinary way. She has engagements across the fields of history, anthropology, but also philosophy. She has worked together with a group of philosophers and political theorists who together have recently started a new journal called Political Concepts, a critical lexicon, a 3rd edition of which is coming out in September. And noted, the philosopher J.L. Austin asked, and the anthropologist Paul Rabinowitz repeated, ethnography, for example, is a way of confounding disciplinary methods and boundaries. Ethnography could be fieldwork in philosophy. Anne agrees. She has another exciting question. She says, could ethnography also be an approach to history making, to the records of history, and to the archive itself, what she's referred to as the pulse of the archive, the pace of its own production? Anne's not interested in categories beyond breaking them. She is very interested in spaces of uncertainty and indeterminacy. In her engagement, in her writing and body of work as a whole, her approach to critical thinking and epistemology, but also more specifically focused in her engagement with the archive. And this focus on indeterminacy harmonizes so beautifully with the emergent quality of her own writing as a tool of analysis and reflection. Anne writes notoriously beautifully and in a poetic way. But she insists over time that we engage with uncomfortable spaces, ragged edges, persons off balance, doubts, awkwardness, stammers. In the colonial situation, Anne is interested not in a sort of teleology of oppression, but in spaces of encounter in which oppression comes, perhaps, to be spaces of the unknown, both for those we study and for our own previously bounded forms of inquiry. Where are the possibilities, the new possibilities, and how can indeterminacy itself become a tool, even precariousness become a tool to understand our subjects and ourselves? As she's shown quite clearly, of course, in her research and writing, she turns to spaces of intimacy, of perceived proximity or desire. And there it is that we can search for newly recognizable forms of social perception and relating, which become visible precisely in their discomfort and contradiction. How are bodies similar or not? How are bodies available or not? How are bodies knowable or not, and to whom? She thinks critically about categories of feeling, sentiment, and affect in the colonial grid as a form of, following Peirce, habit making. These questions of affect and the affective relationships along the colonial grid become a critical and central theme in her work because, as she says, it's this shaping of common sense and the reining in of common sense, which together make up the substance of colonial governance and its working epistemologies. The genealogy of intimacy is one of these methods that can guide us toward spaces at once not yet known, but deeply embodied, the spaces that are at the edges, off balance, emerging. The final thing that I would like to say about Anne's work as a story over time is that if you pay attention, she's engaging consistently with a series of what I would call persistent interlocutors. And here I don't just mean Foucault. I also mean the theorists that she writes with and against. We could think of Marx and Benjamin and Ian Hacking, for example. But also her contemporaries and colleagues in anthropology and history and colonial studies. We could think about E. Valentine Daniel, Jay Bernstein, Linda Gordon, and the late Michel Rolfe-Trouillot. And if we pay attention to these conversations over time, they help us to understand her greater project because her scholarship simply exists at a different level. Right? It is a form of meta-scholarship about the conversations and methods and directions that are possible. When Anne takes a new direction, a whole wave of people are available to participate in those spaces and to form collaborations. Anne is an extremely active and engaged scholar. Beyond the prodigious sort of writing, there's also the reading. She reads all the time. She is very aware of all new projects across interdisciplinary lines in history and anthropology. She knows who's doing what, and it emerges in her writing as a conversation and her citational practices, that beautiful prose. She's sort of digesting all of these projects and ideas as a part of her thinking. Anne is a gracious mentor to so many, and we're lucky to have her here to talk about some of those forms of reflection and meta-scholarship in her talk, A Recursive Mode, Concept Work for Colonial Histories.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. That was almost makes it, irrelevant for me to be talking since Ava said it so well. And I hope that I can live up to all the lovely things she said. It is really a great honor, and I really mean that, to be here to participate in this celebration of the 150th anniversary of Bazarchik University, which I always say the wrong way. I say Bogazachi. So everyone's trying to teach me to say it right. And my special delight to be here as a guest of the sociology department, among whom are cherished colleagues and friends who I haven't seen in a long time, And one who isn't here, I fear, who I was going to just say something about, is Farouk Dertik, who I've enjoyed such dear, wonderful conversations with. And now to find that you have captured one of the jewels, which is Eva Marie Dubesson, who is clearly just one of those students who just made your teaching a total pleasure. So to see her here, to know that she's in the best of company she could be in anywhere, is just one of the nicest things. It is one of those true pleasures that whenever I have a great graduate seminar, I always hope there will be some amazing student from this university to light up the room. That was frequently true when I was at the University of Michigan, and still true at the New School for Social Research. We have a consortium in New York where students who are at NYU, CUNY, Columbia can all take courses across the board. And my last class that I just finished 2 days ago on the politics of sentiment has had an amazing student who was from here, of course, right? So I thank you all for the rigorous and thoughtful training you provide. And that makes having your students such a gift to those of us who inherit them. The work I want to talk about today, it speaks very much in the vein that Eva already has introduced. Is this too loud for people? I mean, I've got such a bellowing voice. I could do it without it. Either way, I just don't want people to have headaches afterwards. Is that okay for everyone? It's okay? Okay. I want to speak to the nature of imperial formations and the concepts we need to think less about what they are than what they do. My reference points are not situated in the nexus of composite empires like that of the Ottoman, but hopefully there will be resonance for those of you whose work is in its prior domain and in contiguous parts of imperial context. The particular set of considerations is part of a new book I'm very close to finishing that I call sometimes Durabilities of Duress, or just sometimes Duress. Concept work for imperial histories. Its spirit is captured by Heidegger's warning in his Art of Teaching, that I quote, "Tyranny is a pedagogic scenario of pure loss. The question of education is no longer the question of how to transmit knowledge, but of how to suspend it," unquote. To that end, I address the imaginaries of imperial polities and their agents, anxious in the face of their failures of prediction, feverish in the pursuit of their anticipatory future tense. Empire as a temporally and spatially rigid misnomer that often fails to register the durabilities of duress, register the durabilities of imperial forms that reach beyond formal legalities, and not least a consideration of what is post in the post-colonial, certainly a question many people have addressed, in the sense that geopolitics and spatial distributions of our world today are not mimetic, recurrent versions of earlier imperial incarnations, but vital and revitalized reworkings of them. And this is sort of key to what I'm thinking about. My interests then are threefold in the distribution of inequities, not only that empire produces, imperial forms produce, but that concepts themselves condone, inscribe, and inhabit. Two, in the challenge of writing new colonial histories that press on the present, and that's probably the strongest trajectory that my work has taken over the last decade, is turning away just from the 19th century Dutch archive, right, to be looking what is going on now. And not least, in unlearning what is imagined to be known about colonial governance and why those understandings and misrecognitions should continue to concern us now. So this current work is an attempt to grow to what I'm calling the occluded histories of empire. By occluded histories, I intend to invoke such acts of obstruction of categories, concepts, ways of knowing that disable linkages to imperial practice and that often go by other names. In its varied etymological senses, occlusion is an act that hides and conceals, creates blockages, closes off, retains undivulged. Occlusion, I want to argue, is not an accidental byproduct of imperial formations. These histories are not just forgotten, as the French like to say, oubli. Oh, oubli, we didn't remember that. Occluded histories are part of imperial formations themselves. They inhere in imperial practices and their conceptual, epistemic, and political architecture. One sense of occlusion comes particularly close to what I have in mind. I quote the OED, a line drawn in the construction of a figure that is missing, or what I would more accurately term disappeared from the finished product. Occluded histories take varied forms. Sometimes they appear as mere mislabelings. For example, children's agricultural colonies, the Colonies agricoles throughout France and the Netherlands in mid-19th century, have long been treated over and over again as part of the history of social reform in Europe, severed from the imperial history of colonial settlement, of which they were a part and for which they were preparing youth. Israeli occupation of Palestine has been treated as a Zionist issue, an international hotspot, as a history of nation-making, not a compounded colonial one. The toxic consequences of Agent Orange that spread 20 million gallons of deadly herbicides across Vietnam by US forces between 1961 and 1971 has been studied as part of environmental history, but rarely joined to the violence of sedimented imperial ones. The blueprints for Bantustans in South Africa were designed on the models of Canadian native reserves after South African officials made visits to Canada for that purpose in the 1950s. For years, I've been trying to work on how to redraw the political logics that could make sense of those splayed lines. Well, are these occluded histories or just histories we've missed and just happen not to know? The occlusions that concern me are not those that bear on redeeming the past, I underscore that, but that bear on how differential futures are meted out, as much as they are about the present. Some features of this occlusion stem from the assumptions of colonial studies, and this is part of the difficulty in a short talk. Some of them stem from the colonial archive itself, and there's this conflation. If much recent work in the field has assumed, and this is a very, very basic assumption in colonial studies, and I would say it across the board, that the connectivities that join colonial past to post-colonial presence are self-evident. We know the colonial story, now we're going to look at the complexity of the present, ready available to identify and access, comforted by such terms as colonial legacy. I start from the contrarian and discomforting claim that they are not. After some 30 years studying colonial practice, I am increasingly convinced that there is often an imperceptible, impressionistic glide, a sort of self-satisfied sort of stance between what we know about colonial practices and how we imagine they manifest now. Here I want to reflect on the conceptual vocabulary, interpretive categories, genres of documentation we might consider to trace new genealogies of imperial governance, both their tangible and intangible effects. Thus, one task would be to trace imperial genealogies that are not constricted and policed by the colonial archives themselves. That sentence is actually really hard to fulfill because we're constantly caught within the nature of the archive. For example, on what grounds have we taken the supremacy of reason, the hallmark of subaltern studies, supremacy of reason, as that which imperial governance implanted, to define the hegemonic principle of imperial governance and what escapes scrutiny by doing so? On what grounds have we taken intimacy as a shorthand for domestic relations, affections, childcare, and sex, a question I raised in the 2010 new preface to Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, but less often, I would argue, to refer to those forms of intimate violence and humiliations in non-domestic space of prisons, checkpoints, immigration offices, as they open to embodied and affective injuries of a different intensity and register. Some occlusions then derive from these colonial scripts. Some derive from what I think of as conceptual habits we bring to them. Sometimes that distinction isn't easy to draw, as I said. Well, why has Victorian India been assumed to provide the quintessential form of imperial sovereignty, when more gradated forms, temporary occupations, in quotes, mandates, protectorates, trusteeships, and military bases have been equally as effective and pervasive in Morocco, in Palestine, in Puerto Rico, in Vieques, and make up not the exception to imperial sovereignty, but its norm. These may seem to be disparate issues, incommensurate misrecognitions and elisions. It's my contention that they are not. Cognitive psychologists tell us that concepts are organizing guides that provide stability to our world. I think they're right, but often the concept is construed as more stable than it is, as are the features of the members assigned to them. And as Nietzsche would argue, the stability itself of concepts is a false one. His observation that, quote, every concept arises from the equation of unequal things, offers a warning and an incitement for rethinking colonial histories of the present. Occluded histories of empire have complex sources that are sometimes difficult to untangle. Some derive from the categories and concepts of those narratives. Some derive, as I've said, from how we've inadvertently called on those logics, simultaneously treating them both against and along the grain. So we work against them, but then we find ourselves using them. This is not to suggest that silenced histories have not been part of colonial studies canon, or that filling in the gaps will create richer, more inclusive stories. It's rather to argue that reimagining imperial fields of force entails refiguring what constitutes colonial archives and what tools we use to redraw those imperial maps. So I'm refusing, in a sense, how those maps are drawn. Some of these sites of the imperial landscape that most interest me are those that veer far from the colonial archives proper. Sometimes at issue is a different sort of reading of what is within the colonial archives and what hovers on their smudged edges, the disruptive asides, the seemingly innocuous comparisons made. Attentiveness to the labor that went into crafting those narratives, and therefore the deceptively smooth coherence of their authority. So I consider this project one of concept work for colonial histories to underscore that work with concepts entails a different stance toward concepts that demand attention to what they implicitly and silently foreclose, as well as what they do. It entails, as I've argued for some time, keeping them provisional, active, and subject to change. And this is a huge issue among graduate students because we sort of teach you as if concepts were there, you should use them, then apply them, take your case. But the really hard part is to treat them provisionally, to do the work with them, not let them stand in fixed forms. And I think that's a problem that we all have once we take something as provisionally. As Deleuze and Guattari remind us, concepts are moving targets. They act in consort. They insisted that they were condensed sites of vibration. I love that image because it doesn't allow you to be still. A concept, then, like empire, like reason, like the intimate, like security, accumulates force from the constellation of other concepts that congeal around it. Well, such a venture raises methodological challenges, not least because concepts and the process of occlusion they harbor and the misrecognitions to which they give rise are not external to the durabilities of imperial formations, nor can we assume that what endures in distorted, partial, or ruined form, be that turns of phrase, forms of disregard or subjugation, techniques of containment and surveillance, sites of enclosure, are merely unwelcome leftovers. That's where the word legacy gets us caught. Unwelcome leftovers or shadow traces of dismantled colonial systems, shorn of their potency and commanding force. Perhaps one of the most striking features of colonial histories are the uneven, almost spasmodic recuperations of concepts, political logics, racial sensibilities and discriminations, and narratives of unaccountability. Imagine to be safely interred and assigned to the past. They belong neither, and this is the other hard part, neither to the left nor the right, nor to those that celebrate colonial history or condemn it. Like racial discourse in practice, they are charged with what Foucault once called polyvalent mobility, a capacity to reverse their course, yielding different politics and possibilities. And I think here of the ways in which Foucault analyzed race. After the 2005 riots, in the poor, mostly immigrant outskirts of French cities, an association of intellectuals and activists came together in an organization that called itself the Natives of the Republic, les Indigènes de la République. Indigène here being the most derogatory word that was used by the colonials, right? It's this kind of reappropriation of it, expressly invoking that colonial category of subjugation to which they linked the discriminatory racial politics of the present and then rallied people neither to accept them or succumb. Immigration problems in colonial history in France would seem hard to miss, and the tactics of the natives of the Republic really almost too obvious, almost to assert a claim, kind of banal. But here, occlusions surfaced, and a battle to assert who could really speak to colonial history. Qualified academics, real historians, or just, as they call them, academic activists, were discredited, made suspect, and dissolved again. Rather than taking occluded sites of blockage as the pedestrian problem of any historical retrieval, hampered by disappeared documents, weakened memory, inevitable loss, here I want to treat them as something else, namely as crucial markers of how colonial truth claims assert themselves, as foundational features of the tenacity of racialized dispositions those truth claims nurture, and the dispositif, the techniques on which they depend. Epistemic, legal, and political clarity have rarely been defining features of colonial polities, even though we sometimes imagine that they were these supreme taxonomic states in which reason was what it was about. It is rather in this messy, troubled space of ambiguous, excise colonial lineages that this venture that I'm trying to work on uneasily rests. Rather than dismiss these sites as aberrant, marginal, quasi-imperial space, here I treat them as key points of access, as enabling disruptions, as Foucault so powerfully redefined an event, this is my favorite definition of an event, as a breach of self-evidence. At those moments when what is taken as common sense no longer works, clarity gives way to doubt, when habits don't do the work they're supposed to do, when even for a brief moment, is that me? Oh, what seemed normal no longer looks the same. So it's that questioning of what is normalcy. Attending then to these occlusions is a lesson that the paper trails of colonial documents underscore and that those who wrestle with colonial archives confront again and again. The challenge in archival labor, it's not pedestrian labor at all, it's conceptual labor, according to my own work, what I believe, is not to allow oneself to revert to received terms or retreat to those in our ready repertoire. when one knows they're inadequate. It could be the term colonialism, intimacy, sovereignty, reason, security, or even the word order, or any other term held too tight, right? Deactivated, shorn of its relational predicates and visceral form. Warding off certainty is partly about prolonging how long one can stay in that indeterminate space. And I think as in graduate school, you got to get finished and you got to give it up and move on and say, this is what I know, and this is what happened, right? Attending more closely to one's own doubt and those of others. Attending more closely to doubt, how it manifests, how it's placated, soothed, or remains disruptive, produces, I think, one of the most productive strains that makes room for other histories. Not least, warding off certainty provides opportunities to question what implicit knowledge makes up colonial common sense, and why certain kinds of colonial situations, and this is the point, why certain kinds have been taken as prototypical, quintessential, and not others. I'm never going to get through this whole paper, but one of the upshots is that I'm trying to actually turn inside out the model of what empires are, not take South Asia as the model, as the type, but take all these other quote-unquote marginal exceptional forms and see what happens to that history when we do so. So I'm taking two tacks and working to undo these occluded genealogies and to identify their recursive qualities. One begins with the 19th century colonial archives to ask what of our conceptual givens have gotten in our way. The second attempts to address the often oblique and unrecognized sites in which these practices, perceptions, geopolitics bear on the present. How do they bear on the present? Where do they exist? What do they look like? Rather than assuming we just know what a colonial legacy is and we can touch it and step in it. Less as inert residuals than in this resilient form. I take these subjacent durabilities, which is what the new book Imperial Debris is about, as an object of inquiry, not as given or fully understood facts. What do we do? And this is the real methodological conceptual dilemma. When colonial effects are dislocated and dislodged from the histories of their content and context, and they're called by other names. The terms substituted, we know them really well. Urban decay, right there, nothing to do with colonialism, it's urban decay, it's about now. Perils of progress, environmental degradation, industrial pollution, racialized unemployment. These are generics that identify damages, that's true, but not the colonial histories that have plotted some of their distributions. Everything is not about colonialism, but some of those distributions of inequity are. A new cartography, I'm arguing, entails a new conceptual figuration and a broader geopolitical map. And one of the things I'm calling upon is something I don't think has been understood or used very much in any of the work on Foucault. And this is his concept and his methodology, and his term genealogy, as a political methodology. And I don't say just a methodology, but a political one. I see it as a response to just these things I've said above. Far more than a fashionable term, as it's now used in the States. I don't know if it's used here, but in the States, it just substitutes history. It just makes whatever you've done just cool, right? And you said a genealogy of religion, a genealogy of this, genealogy of that, instead of a history of X. The Foucauldian insight of genealogy, I think, has been lost. As a methodology, it is a refusal to search for distilled origins, but rather to see differential histories as the product and productive potentials that emerge from tracking dispersed and disparate beginnings, of attending what he really knows, to attend to unrealized possibilities, arrested experiments, failures unadorned as historical events because they never happened, to trace histories, as he puts it, in a piecemeal fashion from alien forms. So it's not distilling it to this is the originary moment of race. This is the originary moment of empire. This is that. But how a disparate set of occasions produces that. Genealogy, as I want to use it here, attends not only to dispersion, but probes the contingencies of power that have made some historical accounts, and this is another hard one, more sayable, more easy to cite, credible, and imagined to be more relevant than others. And relevancy is about the politics of relevancy. What is it that makes it impossible? As I tried to say in the Haunted by Empire book, that was comparing North America imperialisms and French ones. Why is it counterintuitive to look at Native American schools as not part of the colonial project? What is it that's made that not a comparison worth making or that graduate students can viably make? One has to understand the politics of that comparison and what is allowed to be commensurable. Two distinct postures could be said to inform colonial history in the sense of some critics that it's a cottage industry past its prime. And that's pretty prevalent in certain quarters, caught up by frames that have never spoken and no longer speak to the present. One analytic posture treats colonial history with clear temporal and spatial demarcations, well-documented history whose violences have been scrupulously described, whose agents and subjects can be relatively clearly discerned, whose dispositions as colonizer and colonized are understood as constructed, but nevertheless given. Such a posture often assumes that we know the colonial past and now we can move easily to identify a more complex, contemporary machinations of racial inequities as colonial vestiges, right? Or as cultural racism, as if culture was not a part of early, inherent, basic racism and not a part of it as something that's of our present. Within such a frame, colonial agents, and this is a very important political point for me in my own work, were distinctly different than you and me, committed to an imperial world that they full-heartedly, but we decidedly would not embrace. That moral high ground turns history into a self-congratulatory tale, safely other and distant, a purifying exercise that distinguishes us from them. The other posture refuses that clear break and instead insists on a more seamless continuation of colonial practices that pervades the present. Both postures, I would argue, get us in trouble, evading the hardest questions about these durabilities, the unevenness, the temporal difference among them, and may actually get in our way. Neither address directly how this articulation of past and present works or how unevenly modes of environmental degradation, modes of speech address opportunity way differently. While Foucault's formulations have been central to so much work in colonial history on this issue of temporality, what has been borrowed, I think, from his pantheon has offered little help and perhaps has led us astray. And this is where we get to the recursive mode. Discontinuity and rupture have long been taken as the key features of Foucault's innovation. That's almost across the board. That's what Foucault did in response to Braudel, showed that there was discontinuity and rupture. You can't just treat history in the seamless mode. A rejection of the smooth continuities of the sorts of history he rallied against. But I would argue that there is a much more subtle feature in his corpus, one rarely given the due I think it should rightly claim, namely attention to what I call recursive history, one marked by the uneven, unsettled, contingent quality of histories that fold back upon themselves as they reveal new planes. And this notion, once you open up this to not a clear break or not a seamless continuity, then you have this huge area of research that you have to approach that takes, I would say, a huge amount of detailed examination. In this approach, colonial histories are marked less by rupture or continuity and not by repetition, That's really important, but rather by these processes of partial, modified, refigured, muted, and amplified recuperation. So those of you who may be familiar with Achille Mbembe's work on the post-colony, Achille Mbembe is trying to do something like this, but he won't specify it, trying to understand what are these, he calls them deformations of the contemporary African states. What is this over-sex aesthetic of its rulers? And he tries to look at the ways in which it both is part of, related to, different from, but out of a particular notion of the commandement, of command, as was set out in empire. So this is neither the place, nor do I have the time, obviously, to set out the specific text in which Foucault does this. This would be another lecture, another time, but where he alludes to this. But I just want to mention one, which is very, very potent. In his Collège de France lectures on racism and biopolitics, given in the late 1970s, I was struck 20 years ago when I was writing this book on Foucault and Empire, a book entitled Race and the Education of Desire. I was taken by his analyses of the histories of racism and this really prescient argument, so radically different than how racisms and histories of racism have been written about today. And I wrote at the time, in 1995, what occupies Foucault with respect to racisms are the processes of recuperation, of the distillation of earlier discursive imprints, remodeled is the word he uses, in new forms. Displacement and conversion are elements in the dynamic of this process. I still don't know of one single, and if other people do, I would love to hear it, one single study of the thousands of studies of Foucault that grapples with the implications of that insight of his, right? And not one in colonial studies itself. But I think there is very good reason and precedent to do so. One could argue that colonial studies as a field, in fact, emerged precisely around such an issue, excising from the start the very forms of colonial governance that motivated Edward Said's work. If we turn back to the late 1970s when Orientalism hit the shelves and seemed almost single-handedly to spawn what was to become the field of colonial studies, there was this disturbing and curious elision from the very start, a split that separated Said's work on the cultural coordinates of Orientalism as a configuration of power from his simultaneous work on the recursive history of colonization that figured so centrally in his book, The Question of Palestine, published only 1 year apart. One book became everything that we know in colonial studies, right? The other one was dismissed. As we know, the one became a foundational text, enabled this multidisciplinary assault on the West as a concept, on high literature, and its hermetically sealed canon. The other was as though indiscreet and hushed, relegated to the politically committed other Said, a partisan political essay set to the side. However, it is the latter that could have served to lead us to the global network of power relations that join colonialism, Israeli occupation, colonization of Palestine, and its alignments with Western Europe and US agendas to manage Middle East politics and contain Islam with more direct force. To better readings of actually where the thrust of Orientalism was, and it's something that Nadia El-Hajj has noted very recently as well, to US empire. That book was very much about US involvement. I bring up this particular case not to mount a political debate here about the occupation of Palestine over the last 65 years, but rather to underscore the very selective sites and subjects that colonial studies has pursued as a very progressive academic field. and as importantly to ask another sort of question about the limits of critique it has offered and of which I've been a part. To address a similar question to one a dear colleague and friend Nick Dirks posed 2 decades ago. He asked whether colonial studies in 1990 had become safe for scholarship. Yeah? And sort of excision of capitalism, an excision of certain aspects of political economy, excision. He didn't say that. That was not his direction. That's my own. I would pose it differently. Was colonial studies made safe for scholarship from its very beginning by holding these 2 texts apart? Which prompts yet another question. What would colonial studies look like? What would the major sites of imperial sovereignty look like today if both texts had been given the same analytic weight to define the post-colonial agenda and to craft its critical canon? For one, how much time do I have? Good. For one, what emerged as a quintessential site of colonial hegemony, South Asia, may not have had the centrality it has assigned itself and claimed. True, subaltern studies emerged in India, but the range of imperial forms that have appeared over the last century and have been delegated as exceptions to the Victorian Indian model of empire that I mentioned earlier, mandates, protectorates, unincorporated territories, trusteeships, and might not have been seen as the outer fringes of imperial exception, but as constitutive imperial forms. It's why I use the term, rather than empire, imperial formations, more often than empire, to register the ongoing quality of processes of decimation, displacement, and reclamation. These are relations of force. They harbor political forms that endure beyond the formal exclusions that legislate against equal opportunity. Working with this concept of imperial formation has really been productive, and not only for me, but for a lot of scholars working on Japan and Korea, working on Puerto Rico, working in areas that on military bases, US military bases, and lots of other areas that have always been sort of put outside the canon. It shifts the emphasis from clear-cut, fixed forms of sovereignty and it's to gradated forms of sovereignty and what has long marked the technologies of imperial rule, sliding, contested, and embattled scales of differential access and rights. So the emphasis is put elsewhere on that contestation that keeps moving backwards and forwards. Unlike empires, imperial formations are processes of becoming. They're not fixed things. They are, what I would argue, states of deferral that met out promissory notes. If you're only more developed, if you're only, get better schools, if you only get your political act together and stop fighting with each other, then we'll give you sovereignty. We'll give you sovereignty. So they're promissory notes for delayed autonomy, temporary intervention in the name of peace, conditional tutelage, military takeover in the name of humanitarian work, violent intervention in the name of human rights, and elaborate security regimes in the name of peace. A second occlusion. Both of sides' books place the US as part of a constellation, an imperial constellation. It's not then that US imperial pursuits in the Middle East were not present in the book Orientalism. In fact, what is really striking is that Said's wrath, I was an undergraduate at Columbia at that time. I remember this very, very clearly at Barnard and then Columbia. Said's wrath was directed precisely at the US as an imperial force and at American social scientists, which he put in quotes, as he put it, as those who conferred upon themselves intellectual authority, marked by, I quote, a ponderous style of expertise. If French and British literary texts were crucial to his argument, it was Orientalism as a strategic formation and a transnational one that methodologically guided his work, with Islam figured as the quote-unquote lasting trauma and drama of Europe. One wonders then whether the absence of post-colonial scholars in public debates after 9/11, a space occupied by right-wing political scientists, hailing the benefits of a new liberal, compassionate, light empire, L-I-T-E, and the lessons of empire that might have been learned about counterinsurgency from France's war in Algeria, the Battle of Algiers was shown at the Pentagon, might have looked different. When we, that is those people in colonial studies, did enter the debate, finally, on the issue of Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, torture, homophobia, sexual violence, it just wasn't clear that the earlier preoccupations of those of us who had worked on the sexual politics of empire did more than get in the way. And that's very not okay to say. Again, what's striking is, until recently, how assiduously the US was exercised from the colonial equation, and in some scholarship remains so. But the landscape is just changing just by the day. It's just extraordinary what's happening now. Studies of US imperial investments have just mushroomed. Al McCoy, an historian from Madison, University of Wisconsin, has done this work on the emergence of the US surveillance state as one forged on the experimental terrain of counterinsurgency projects in the early 20th century colonial Philippines. And he reconnects that history that's been pulled apart. Craig Crandon's study of Fordlandia reminds us that the ruins of Detroit and the visions of a middle-class utopia that Ford attempted to carve out in the Brazilian forest to make way for rubber plantations for the automobile industry are both part, not just of urban decay, not just the internal racial history of the US, but part of a larger landscape of imperial ruin and ruination, and of those subsumed by it. Similarly, intelligence networks, not always formal sovereignty, have been demonstrated to provide the architecture of British imperial pursuits throughout the Middle East, as well as French Empire's structural imperative for militarized terror in North Africa. See Marnia Lazarik's work on this issue, just incredible. These recent revisions have been predicated in part on reassessing what constitutes contemporary colonial practice, what counts as an imperial pursuit, and which geopolities rest on residual or emergent forms of empire, right? They resituate security and intelligence and the technologies of fear and expectant danger on which they're based at the center of political rationalities in its durable form. And this is where so much of the issue of the politics of sentiment and the politics of affect comes into play, at the very center of political rationality. The next section is work I've done on trying to tease apart what we understand about colonies and what we imagine a colony to be, and looking at political concepts that are not already conferred and given the name political concepts, but how certain political concepts actually exist in a supposedly benign form as just nouns or terms that actually don't do any political work. And this section is very hard because it tries to play with penal colonies, children's agricultural colonies, military colonies, and then it blends in history. I'm following this through a whole set of archives that are not considered imperial archives, that blend into camps, that blend into refugee camps that were used, that were partially penal colonies, later used as camps and sites of detention. And tracing here the ambiguity, rather than dismissing the ambiguity of the nomenclature, right? Taking that ambiguity as a site of the political. The colony then does more than it criminalizes dissidents. It produces enemies within and without, and anxiously awaits their moments of capture. So the very term, the way it's deployed, colony, already produces an enemy within and those that have to be looked after. Its agents are emboldened by the fervent search for those who elude its strictures by disguise. So that internal enemy is always potentially in disguise. The term that the French love to use was fraudulent. They were never the real thing. They were always passing. They could always be in your midst and sitting next to you in a lecture. Those most favored, disdained, and held in contempt are those whose speech and comportment allow them to pass. If the concept of security, as Foucault argued, is one that works on possible events as much as on those that are recurrent and operative, then the colony as a political concept is in part defined by its potentiality. The problem of security may be muted or manifest, confronted or quelled with different degrees of intensity, but the incitement to and the leveraging of security over and over again, just the supposed buzzword of our time, of that which must be potentially defended against, is at its heart. Agamben insists that its security has become a veritable, I quote, paradigm of government today. But it has been paradigmatic and elemental for the practices of imperial governance, far longer than his assertion suggests. It raises an issue that eluded both Foucault's treatment of the carceral archipelago in Discipline and Punish, from which he excluded the penal colony as too early and the camp as too extreme, as well as Agamben's own treatment of the refugee camp as the exception that has become the nomos of the modern and the norm. The colony and the camp are both containments, enclosures, and unsettled, not settlements, but unsettled encampments that are more closely aligned than we have imagined. They share what Wittgenstein would call a family resemblance, not any one essential core feature, so much as a, quote, overlapping, crisscrossing, complicated set of similarities, unquote. Colony and camp make up a conjoined conceptual matrix. They borrow and blend features of their protective architecture and their anticipatory fear. They are in deadly embrace from the start. Such a perspective fundamentally alters what Foucault called the carceral archipelago. It spans its horizon in time and space. It brings the detention camp, the refugee camp, the agricultural colonies in Algeria were for poor urban kids who were abandoned, that morphed then into military camps in Algeria into a network with competing political logics, but one historical frame. This issue of les colonies agricoles is almost unmarked, but it is, in Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the form in maître, for those of you who remember that term, maître, agricultural colony, the site of the modern. Now this is fascinating, that these agricultural colonies for wayward boys that actually were tied to Algeria and very similar to the military encampments is the site of the modern. It takes us back to Henri Dussels' notion that colonialism is the underside of the modern, right? But it never appears in any commentary on Foucault, or does Foucault make that association. So what I've done over the last 10 years is track all of these. Instead of just saying, oh, it's a homonym colony, you know, I'm just pushing it, just track how they move and what kind of borrowed vocabulary and practices came out of it. It's almost gives you frisson and makes you sort of get a chill, because nothing in the archive tells you it should be that way. Nothing in colonial history tells you it should be that way. This is European history, and the other one is about penal colonies, and that's not the modern. We know penal colonies are kind of, you know, of another moment. So I'm trying to, in this particular example, which I'm not going to get to the other three, a colony that I want to argue doesn't announce itself as a political concept. This is what I'm trying to do, is actually figure out those sites in which it's demurred, right? In which it doesn't seem to be activated, right? It's a political concept. It's not a political concept in that formal sense, but it exerts its force nonetheless. It organizes visions, imaginaries, and futures. It's a political concept completed only by what attaches to it, what is excluded from it, and what it attaches to. It's always relational. There is no camp or colony that is not in relationship to another norm, right? To a supposed non-enclosed, non-partitioned space, measured against and distinct from the broader and more stable normative physical, political, social space. What I really actually want to argue is that a colony as a political concept is not a place, it's a principle of managed mobilities, dislocating and relocating peoples according to a set of changing rules and hierarchies that actually orders social kinds. Those eligible for recruitment, those who get subsidized or forced resettlement, for extreme deprivation or privilege, prioritized residence or confinement. This does not occur in a given fixed designated space beforehand, demarcated once and for all. Its borders shift, as do the means to secure them. The last section I won't go into is about where we've gotten caught in imagining that reason is the most prevalent way in which disciplinary forms have taken place in imperial formations. And I'm arguing that we've missed an enormously powerful site of the anticipatory, the preemptive, the fearful, that which has to be avoided within imperial formations, and what kinds of institutions, relations, and practices get mobilized in this conditional future tense. I'd argue that we've kind of read the colonial archive wrong in understanding or thinking that it's ever in the present tense or in the passé composé as that which is over. But if one reads really carefully along its grain, it's always in, if we don't do X, we'll be confronted with Y. If we don't close off this border, we're going to have the enemy upon us. Or if we don't keep out those mixed bloods, we're going to have those who are passing in disguise and have the enemy within. The last section is on imperial debris and trying to take the term ruin, which has always been a part of the colonial, history, look at the colonial ruins, and take it and reactivate it as a violent verb. Not talk about ruin, but ruination and to ruin. And look not at the ruins of, that Israel has decided, we're really part of Jewish history, but actually that which is buried under them, which are Palestinian villages, that are not ever given a capital R named ruins at all, because those are not already within that imaginary. That's part of the occlusion that I'm interested in tracking. So in conclusion, one task of a renewed colonial histories would be to sharpen our senses and sense of how to track the tangibilities of empire as effective histories of the present. This would not be to settle scores of the past, to dredge up what is long gone, but to refocus a finer historical lens on distinctions between what is residual and tenacious, what is dominant but hard to see. At least one challenge is not to imagine either the post-colony or the post-colonial imperium as replicas of earlier degradations or as the inadvertent and inactive leftovers of more violent colonial relations that are our heritage. It is rather to track how new formations, new forms of debris work on matter and mind to eat through people's resources and resiliencies, as they also embolden new political actors with indignant refusal, forging unanticipated and empowered alliances. Thank you very much.
conversation. Looks like there's a microphone.
Could be just a comment, doesn't have to be a question.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. I would like to ask about the boundaries and the difficulties of post-colonial studies. I've recently witnessed a tendency that post-colonial studies is, so to say, stood upon its head, that it is employed not in a progressive way, but in a very conservative way. I've witnessed this only in my home country of Germany. I don't know how far it's true for other countries. But to give just an example, one of the first scholars who brought post-colonial studies to Germany and really fascinated me, I was a master's student then, he's now working at an interdisciplinary research project called Governance. And governance is understood in a very straightforward way, not in the way in a very straightforward way, not as an analytical category like we have Foucault, but really as a way for the German government to forward neocolonial policies to understand how to subdue resistance and how to subdue. Sorry,
what's his name?
Sebastian Conrad. Oh, actually, yeah. So I would like to ask you if you think this is a general problem, and if it's tied to some conceptual problem of post-colonial studies. If this is just misuse, or if you can tie this to the two texts, to the origins of two texts, to Said's Orientalism and to Said's book on Palestine.
Well, it's a very good question, and I wouldn't either argue that as one or the other. I mean, this is, I can't. What is so extraordinary is at precisely the moment, you know, Stuart Hall said this many, many years ago, just when people were getting identities, the liberal left decided that identity politics was not cool. And there's a way in which there's a redistribution of where colonial studies is actually being fortified and valorized, and it's opening up spaces that were literally absolutely not to be spoken about in Japanese history, in Korean history, in Canada. You know, they're going nuts over looking and finally tracking some of the genealogies, actual genealogies of Bantustan. I hope. But really looking at this sort of native settlement projects as part of a colonial project rather than just as an indigenous problem. One thing that's happened in the German stuff that's kind of disturbing is in the switch to say, look, everything doesn't go from metropole to colony. Now let's look at how everything goes from colony to metropole. They've kind of stood it on its head and say, you know where Nazism came from? How the Germans treated the Herero. So it's without actually being historians of those archives. They're setting up a beeline between these earlier genocidal projects and arguing that what that empire did is provided the template for it. These are being played out in politics everywhere. There's a guy, Olivier Lecourt-Grandmaison, who's written a book called Coloniser, Exterminer. To colonize is to exterminate. He has been slayed in France. No one will invite him to anything. They say he's not a real historian. He's set out, from everything I know of the archives, everything he said is absolutely on target. But the politics of that suggestion, so it's very hard to map it as this is the whole trend of it, because I see it very uneven, taken up in very, very different ways. And I feel like I'm in a very exciting site to be called upon, and in various different places to sort of say, well, how do you think could this work for us? Can we think this through? What are the shortfalls of doing so? I don't know the answer to that, but if Foucault's right about very, very powerful concepts, they do have that polyvalent mobility. They do. They can change from erudite and qualified knowledge to disqualified knowledge in a turn like that. I think it's really important for someone to track how it's being used in Germany, but thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for a really fascinating and exciting. I mean, you know, I was sort of kind of moving in my seat as I was trying to think of all the different areas with which I could link what you were saying. One of the, for example, the Natives of the Republic, that feminist group, Hatija Boutelja, and I mean, you know, they're really out of this world, in my view, as well. A question has to do with the way in which you conceptualize the archive. It reminded me of the way in which Brinkley Messick writes about Islamic texts. And what was, I mean, one of the moves which you make, not only in what you're saying today, but also in your work, is the way in which, you know, the text of the other, Islam, what you do the same thing to the European text. I mean, there is that reversal. I was wondering whether you have sort of, you want to make that sort of reversal, whether you want your work to speak to that side of things. Another thing which struck me also was, okay, you talk a lot about Foucault, but there is so much Deleuze and Guattari in what you're saying.
Yes, huge amount.
Yes.
I cut out some of that, but that's absolutely right. Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, the new project that I've been working on, which is fieldwork in philosophy, is all centered around what is a concept and what kind of work does it do, and the constellation of concepts. And that's what I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar on right now. What I'm interested in doing is finding a way to produce not an archive that's already there, that tells me what's allowed and what is policed and what can be in it, but a virtual archive is what I call it, actually, that tracks the counterintuitive connectivities that join them in ways that the archive itself almost disallows, right? And that don't appear as part of the colonial story. And to try to understand both what that elision is, not just silencing the past, but it actually makes another story of what this imperial form even looks like. So the impetus for some of this work came from an 1854, 4-volume, 2,000-page, this was very common, it was not like, oh, I read 2,000 pages, treatise on what are we going to do with these agricultural colonies, these kids in France. Nothing, but nothing, supposedly, to do with empire. And it was trying to find ways, I think methodology is the hardest conceptual work. Figure out ways of not being caught by the terms in which this was already defined. How to suspend that which I already saw as these insidious categories, but not even to think about those, to literally let in more space for other kinds of things going. So these agricultural colonies get tied up with the most amazing things, with the Philadelphia prisons, with de Tocqueville, who visited the Philadelphia prison and thought Maitreyi was one of the hottest, best models for dealing with the poor and not having revolution. De Tocqueville, who then went to Algeria and used what he had learned in the US. If you track it, I'm going to do a map of it, literally. It's extraordinary. Of this guy de Tourdonnet, who draws on Russian models of penal colonies as well as children's orphanages. Okay, how do you get that kind of commensurability? Not my commensurability. How do you make an account for what makes those things commensurable? And it's almost the question that Foucault asked in The Order of Things in the Chinese, right, encyclopedia. What makes those commensurable? Not in terms of what you and I think in political economy or cultural studies or anthropology, but can you get to a place where that political rationality of why it totally makes sense to look to those places as far afield actually matter in thinking out the nature of what it is to govern. That's what I want to understand. And then I want to understand why I couldn't see this relationship between the Bantustan and Canada. What made that impossible when we know those records are there and it's never been written? And what are the politics of that? So thank you for your question. Brink and I were our old dear friends. We were at Michigan together. You know, there was a whole kind of gang of us thinking between history and anthro, Brink and Val Daniel and Nick Dirks and myself. And, you know, we just went back and forth. And, you know, it was ethnography of the archives, it was ethnography in the archives. But we grew up intellectually in a moment when the coolest thing was everything's against the grain. Benjamin has told us, read history against the grain. Excuse me. But not necessarily against the archive. Because by reading against the archive, you already assume you know what power looks like. You already assume you know what authority looks like. You already assume you know who's the bad guy and who's a good guy, and everything's clear. So I wanted to like pull that rug out from all of us in some way.
Well, I'm totally ignorant and naive about this subject, so my question may be quite primitive.
Probably the best kind.
What's the difference between Canada and India as colonies, as examples?
Well, one is a settler colony, and that's been, one is a settler colony, and that's been a huge part of how people have been trying to develop that kind of characterization. I actually don't know, I do know. I don't agree with it. I think that what we've gotten caught in is imagining that Australia and Canada and the US and South Africa were settler colonies of the exceptions and of a totally different kind. The reason I've developed this thinking around gradations of sovereignty is to put the emphasis on a different, as we say, syllable, a different syllable, right? And put the emphasis not on the fixity of the settler form, as if it's, because that's a form now being used to identify Israel, right? That's everything's settler colonialism, everything. But actually the enormous daily confrontation that story is a part of these relations of power. So I would ask us to suspend actually the difference and ask first about what are some of the common similarities and what happened in that process, in those genealogies that made for such differential kinds of success. It would be a different tact. I wouldn't start with, okay, these are the 4 points in which Canada differs from X. But try to understanding something about the political rationales and what they were confronted with that it came out with such different sort of forms. I've never been someone really strong on conclusions, but sort of better, no, I mean that. Actually, it's perhaps a weakness, but on better questions. That's what I want to get at, better questions, because I think it's not the better answers, and then you do agree or disagree, but questions that actually lead in other kinds of directions. That's what my own quest is, you know. So thank you. That's not a primitive question at all. It's a really fundamental one.
Terminology maybe is wrong. Canada should not probably be called a colony, but India.
Yeah, but Native Americans would say they were colonized. I'm not sure they'd agree.
The level of being...
The level of rape, violence, imposition on Native Americans was huge.
Nevertheless, the situation, let's say, civilization type of state levels of those regions were quite different.
Right.
Extremely different. So actually, the main inhabitants of Canada
Was a much larger.
more Europeans than
Absolutely,
natives.
absolutely.
So
But these were
that's
not.
a major difference.
These were not fixed decisions. I mean, we can look back in mid-19th century to the initiatives in India that were going to bring poor Scottish farmers and Irish farmers, and they decided not to. And you know why? Because they didn't want poor whites around in India. These were not just par hasard. These were not just, oh, you know, we don't want to have settlers. There were certain settlers and kinds of settlers they didn't want. If we look at the situation in South Africa, the entire white settler, poor white problem was the setup for the proto-apartheid state. That issue about where poor whites were allowed to be and where they weren't, you could actually carve out a huge part of the different forms of imperial formations by looking at the policies around poor whites, when they were allowed in and when they weren't, and what the consequences of that were. So anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. My question is rather simple. Can we think of the everyday relations like violence, not coming from the state, but violence in the everyday, like violence against women, as imperial effects?
Yeah. This is a major issue too. This is, you know, Angela Garcia has just written a book on New Mexico. Do you know the book? The Pastoral Clinic, which is about heroin addiction and crack in the Southwest. And she wants to argue that 200 years later, the reason we have the domestic violence is because of colonialism, 200 years earlier. Because of colonialism 200 years earlier, without doing that history. And she's a wonderful young scholar, and this issue is what sort of imperial debris is trying to deal with in some ways. I think before we can ask that, I think we have to do a lot more homework than we've done. I think it's too easy, too simple, and not convincing to make those kinds of arguments. And I think they end up being actually work against exactly the project that people are trying to deal with. It's come up in terms of what's going on in the banlieue, in Paris. I mean, there's so many sites of that, but it's why I'm putting so much focus on being somewhat more humble in the face of what we know about this duress and the durabilities, what it looks like, what its temporalities are like, some being of a really long durée, some being really short-lived, some taking on new forms unevenly. We don't even study it because we already assume we know what the colonial legacy is. Oh, it's race in London. Oh, it's this here. That's not an analysis. That's a political position. Political positions have to be backed by really careful critical analysis. Otherwise, you're out the door. You can see it in France right now. You know, these people are dismissed, utterly dismissed. How do you make sure that the politics of your knowledge is being used the right way, and that you don't just retreat to a political position? And I guess that's for me the bottom line. I will not just make an answer to that unless I know what's going on. I was just at a conference on East Asia, on Japan and Ainu, and a young woman was there, and she was, wanted to argue that the domestic violence right now among the Ainu is a consequence of Japanese colonization of Ainu and how they were treated, and the women wore the tattoos they wore as protection against Japanese soldiers. It's a hypothesis, but then that work has to be, and it's very hard to do that work. So much of it is undocumented. As I found in the French archives, they were enlevés, pas disponibles, not available, the ones on prostitution, not on white traffic, on traffic in white women, on rape. So there's a lot of conjecture, I think, that comes out of it. And I worry of too much conjecture, which is why Imperial Debris is asking the question rather than having the answer, right? I mean, if you look at Agent Orange as only an environmental problem, and you don't see that these kids 3 generations later are deformed without arms and legs, and you make that just the hazards of war, collateral damage, you've done something to really warp the nature of that history. So I struggle with it. I never stop struggling with it. I think everything I do is about this last book, this next one, which is why the third project on concept work, on fieldwork and philosophy, is to recoup that space of the politics of where our concepts come from and where they're generated from, rather than just from Hegel, right?
I think I might actually ask just one question, which is what you're talking about now makes me think about the possibility of multiplicities of colonialisms across the same geography.
Yes.
And
yes.
I work in the former Soviet Union, so this is a critical point, and such that any kind of archive, record, absence, occlusion, they're spread across this bizarrely gigantic geography, such to never find each other.
Yeah.
And it makes sometimes a project seem impossible.
It does, yeah.
How do we make archives in different places speak to one another, and what might be necessary for this sort of conversation?
I knew you'd ask a question I can't answer. I just have a very simple answer. You just keep doing the work. You just keep tracking the traces. You just stay there with it. You just can't do it fast and dirty. It's just, I mean, what Eva's referring to is so important. When Fred Cooper and I did the book Tensions of Empire, and we started the work in 1987 and finally came out in 1997, we were trying to get at that, what we call this modular quality of colonialism. It's not like one is just planted on top of the other. What's so confusing in so many places is they take certain parts of them, small parts, or then you've got composite colonialisms, which are sedimented on one another. Or you have what Scott Atran called in Palestine a surrogate colonialisms, in which a lot of what was being done, right, by the British, later by Israelis, is actually working with U.S. enormous amounts of investments, financial, educational, everything. Not a word about the U.S. No one's written actually that story yet. You know, there is stuff on U.S. and its interest in the Middle East, but it's a different story than putting it within this frame. And I don't know, I think it just takes the work sticking with it, but not shortcuts.
Thank you for an interesting talk. Another disclaimer about asking a question from ignorance. I have enjoyed your search, if I understood, for looking for different imperial formations outside of the classic ones that one use, and from which different theories and concepts are driven from, British being the most powerful, French of certain kind, etc. Now, this, having opened this instability of concepts and looking at it. I mean, your talk was both substantive and also stepping back and looking at what you were saying simultaneously. So my question will be on the second order. What makes a formation an imperial formation? Having excited by your looking for these formations all over, I now start to think about what kind of exercise of power is merits to be called, or demerits to be called imperial, and what's the relationship of the term colonial to the concept imperial? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful question, and it's a question that comes up all the time. How to retain some instability right? But still have some sense that there are certain kinds of features about a takeover of land, of changes in who have rights to it, of the ways in which categories of persons are excluded or not from having certain kinds of rights, and the actual scale of it. But I don't know if you're going to get very many historians that are actually going to agree on any of those elements alone. Right after 9/11, there was a conference at SSRC called Lessons of Empire, in which about 15 people worked for 20 years on empire, were brought into the room, and we couldn't agree on almost anything. It was abysmal. And we got so caught in the definitions that we found that at the end we didn't actually discuss the practices. That's why I started this saying, I want to know what they do, not what they are. I'm not going to start with definitions. But that's not to dismiss your question. It's a major, major question. Because the problem with something like you look at Hart and Agree, they've decided that there is an old imperial form. People know Hart and Agree's work on empire. Maybe you know if you've heard of it. And now they want to say there's a new thing called empire, E, with a capital E, right? And they're distinguishing it along the most bizarre criteria. These are people who are not historians. They're great, political theorists at some level, but they don't know colonial archives and colonial history. So they've decided that the new empire is actually transnational, that's been a case for a really long time, that it's made up of hybrid forms, that unlike the old empire, which had really clear distinguishing marks and was taxonomic, everybody knew it was colonizer and colonized, they didn't, they fought for it, they debated it, there was conflict over it. So for me, that's an example. It's not what they've said about the new empire that disturbs me. It's what they assumed is different about what they don't know about the old, right? So that sets up a typology that we're, again, looking at newness over and over again. So how to keep that balance between that which is been there for some time in other forms and that which really doesn't fold into it at all, right? And this is the conversation I'm always having with people on globalization, right? Well, is this part of globalization? Is globalization a part of it? Why are you even bringing up empire? Been there, done that. I am convinced that where waste is dumped, not the fact of waste, as Zimmermann Bauman would tell us, and that there are wasted people, but where it's dumped and who become those wasted people who are remnants has a very powerful colonial history, and that it's just not par hasard. So I'm attaching it to part of a history, but not limiting it to the forms in which it is. Now, the other problem that your question raises is how much colonialism is used as a metaphor for everything. Don't colonize me, or in other, no one really says it that way, but oh, that was so colonial, right? What are the problems in that? Which goes back to the question about domestic violence now. That's so colonial. I think Said was right on one really important thing that was constantly put aside in a way, and not everybody, but Orientalism wasn't an ideology. It was a configuration of power, right? And it was a configuration of power. He defines it in many different ways, but it's a configuration of power that is both tangible, intangible, institutional, epistemic, that has so many different elements. And I guess that's how I see imperial formations. I don't see them as just an ideology that's just imposed. Or I had a student who wanted to say that the fashion world is colonial in New York. And I don't think you want to do that. I'm not sure you want to do that. It doesn't mean that one couldn't do an analysis of the way in which clothing and distinctions of clothing actually really marked off who was excluded and who wasn't, and what kinds of racial exclusions. But I think that is a kind of dangerous lesson for us to impart, that would be, you know, let's call everything and anything. But thank you for your question.
I might actually suggest at this point that we think about moving our broader conversation to, and we're holding a reception in Anne's honor, which will be held outside Albert Long Hall. And we invite you all to please join us there and continue the conversation. We'd like to very warmly thank Anne for being here with us and for your voice and meta scholarship.